Captain Robert Bob Johnson's leather-gloved hands gripped the control stick of his P-51B Mustang as he watched something that defied everything German fighter doctrine had promised was impossible. Fuel gauge reading showed he still had 45 minutes of combat time remaining 450 miles from his base in England. The silvery auxiliary tanks hanging beneath his wings had just rewritten the entire strategic equation of the air war over Europe. What the 26-year-old fighter pilot from Sacramento, California didn't know was that in the next 90 minutes, his squadron's presence this deep over Germany would shatter the Luftwaffe's fundamental defensive strategy and prove that American bombers would never again fly alone into the Reich's heartland. That morning would demonstrate something the German High Command had calculated to be aerodynamically and logistically impossible, that single-engine fighters could escort heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back, that the mathematical certainty of fuel exhaustion, the invisible shield that had protected German industry for years, could be overcome by two simple metal tanks, that a technical innovation dismissed by Luftwaffe intelligence as propaganda would render obsolete the entire defensive doctrine that had cost the 8th Air Force thousands of airmen. The story that would unfold over the coming months would fundamentally alter World War II's outcome, though it would take decades for historians to fully appreciate how close the Allied strategic bombing campaign had come to catastrophic failure. But the truth, when it finally emerged through declassified mission reports and German archives, would reveal that the P-51 Mustang's extended range capability represented not just a tactical advantage, but the single most decisive turning point in the air war over Europe. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Captain Robert Johnson had woken that morning at RAF Debden in Essex, England, knowing he was about to attempt something that 18 months of brutal combat had proven suicidal, escorting heavy bombers deep into Germany. At 26, Johnson was already a veteran with 11 confirmed kills and a reputation as one of the most aggressive pilots in the 4th Fighter Group. A mechanic's son from Sacramento, he had learned to fly in California's Central Valley, where the endless flat horizons had taught him to read distance and space with an instinct that would later save his life dozens of times over Europe. But this morning's mission briefing had presented a mathematical problem that no amount of skill or courage could solve. The target was the Erkner ball-bearing plant, one of the facilities that kept the Wehrmacht's tanks and aircraft operational. Located in Berlin's southeastern suburbs, it sat 580 miles from the English coast. The round trip, 1,160 miles. Every fighter pilot in the room knew the numbers by heart. A P-47 Thunderbolt, their primary escort fighter until recently, had an effective combat radius of 230 miles with internal fuel only. Even with a single 150-gallon belly tank, it could manage perhaps 375 miles before fuel exhaustion forced it to turn back. The P-38 Lightning could stretch to maybe 450 miles, but its twin engines consumed fuel voraciously in combat. For 18 months, this mathematical reality had created what bomber crews called the gap, vast stretches of German airspace where American heavy bombers flew without fighter protection. It was in this gap that the Luftwaffe concentrated its forces. It was in this gap that B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds fell from the sky in numbers that made the continuation of the strategic bombing campaign itself a subject of desperate debate at the highest levels of Allied command. The previous October, Black Thursday, October 14th, 1943, the 8th Air Force had sent 291 bombers to strike the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. 60 bombers never returned. Another 17 were so badly damaged they would never fly again. 650 airmen were dead, missing, or captured. The loss rate had been 26%, mathematically unsustainable. A few more missions like that and the 8th Air Force would cease to exist. The problem wasn't courage. American bomber crews had demonstrated almost suicidal bravery, flying day after day into concentrated fighter attacks and flak that turned the sky black. The problem wasn't equipment. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator were magnificent aircraft. The problem was simple mathematics. Unescorted bombers, no matter how heavily armed, could not survive against concentrated fighter attack. The Germans had learned to let the short-range American fighters reach their fuel limits and turn back. Then, with the bombers exposed and vulnerable, Luftwaffe fighters attacked in waves. Messerschmitt 109 seconds, Focke-Wulf 190 seconds, even twin-engine Me 110 seconds loaded with rockets. Designed specifically to break up bomber formations, they hit the Americans again and again until the bomber stream disintegrated. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, had calculated that American losses would become unsustainable long before German industrial capacity was seriously degraded. He had been right. By late 1943, the strategic bombing campaign was failing. But this morning, March 6th, 1944, something had changed. The mission briefing officer, a major who had flown bombers until his aircraft was shot out from under him over France, stood before a map of Europe, covered in coloured strings showing the planned route. His voice carried a note of barely suppressed excitement. "Gentlemen, today you're going all the way to Berlin." A murmur ran through the assembled pilots. Several laughed, thinking it was a joke. Berlin was impossibly far, everyone knew that. The major continued, ignoring the reaction. "You'll be flying P-51B Mustangs equipped with two 108-gallon external drop tanks in addition to your internal fuel. Total fuel capacity, approximately 419 gallons. That gives you an effective combat radius of 850 miles. The room fell silent. 850 miles. That was beyond Berlin. That was deeper into Germany than any Allied fighter had ever penetrated. The mathematics were suddenly impossibly different. The P-51 Mustang itself was already legendary among pilots who had flown it, though still relatively new to the European theatre in significant numbers. Designed by North American Aviation in just 102 days in 1940, it had originally been built for the British Royal Air Force. The British had needed fighters desperately during the Battle of Britain, and American industry had delivered. But the early Mustangs had a fatal flaw. Their Allison engines performed poorly at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, they were sluggish, underpowered, outclassed by German fighters. The RAF relegated them to low-level reconnaissance and ground attack roles where they performed adequately but not brilliantly. Then someone had a revolutionary idea. Mate the Mustang's superb airframe with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant that drove the legendary Spitfire. The result was the P-51B and P-51C models, aircraft that combined speed, maneuverability, and altitude performance in a package that could outfight anything Germany had. But even the Merlin-powered Mustang faced the same fundamental limitation as every other single-engine fighter: fuel capacity. Its internal tanks held 184 gallons, giving it excellent range compared to other fighters about 400 miles radius, but still nowhere near enough to escort bombers to Berlin and back. The solution had been conceptually simple, practically complex: external drop tanks. The idea of auxiliary fuel tanks wasn't new. Aircraft had carried external tanks since World War I, but implementing them successfully on a high-performance fighter operating at the edge of its performance envelope, at altitudes where temperatures dropped to -50 degrees Celsius, while maintaining the aircraft's combat capability that was enormously difficult. The tanks had to be aerodynamically clean to avoid creating drag that would defeat their purpose. They had to feed fuel reliably to the engine at high altitude. They had to be easily jettisoned when combat began, because no pilot could dogfight with hundreds of pounds of dead weight hanging under his wings. They had to be cheap and simple enough to manufacture by the thousands. The solution finally implemented was elegant. Pressed metal tanks, teardrop-shaped to minimize drag, equipped with pressurization systems to force fuel into the engine at altitude, attached to wing pylons with explosive bolts for instant jettison. Two 108-gallon tanks, one under each wing, added 216 gallons to the Mustang's internal 184 gallons, plus a 85-gallon fuselage tank. Total, 485 gallons of fuel. At the Mustang's economical cruise settings around 280 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, that fuel would last approximately 4 hours and 45 minutes of flight time. The round trip to Berlin would take approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes, leaving 25 minutes for combat. It was barely enough, but it was enough. Not everyone believed it would work. German military intelligence, the Abwehr, had received reports about Allied experiments with drop tanks since late 1943. Their analysts had studied the concept and concluded it was impractical. Oberst Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe fighter ace with over 170 victories, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 77, had read the intelligence reports with professional skepticism. Steinhoff was a thoughtful, analytical pilot who had survived 5 years of combat by understanding capabilities and limitations with mathematical precision. The Americans are desperate, he had told his squadron commanders during a briefing in February 1944. They're trying psychological warfare, making us worry about threats that don't exist. The physics are clear. A single-engine fighter cannot carry enough fuel to escort bombers to Berlin. The weight would make the aircraft unmaneuverable. The drag would consume any range advantage. It's propaganda. Luftwaffe defensive doctrine was built entirely on this assumption. Let the American Escort fighters reach their fuel exhaustion point, usually somewhere over Western Germany, then attack the bombers with concentrated force. The defensive fighter belt around Berlin, the Reichsverteidigung, was positioned accordingly. Heavy fighter concentrations sat at air bases, from which they could intercept unescorted bombers approaching Germany's industrial heartland. The strategy had worked devastatingly well. American bomber losses in late 1943 had reached crisis levels. If the trend continued, the Allies would be forced to abandon daylight strategic bombing entirely, switching to the British approach of nighttime area bombing, less accurate, less effective against specific industrial targets. But Steinhoff was about to discover that intelligence reports and mathematical calculations meant nothing against engineering reality. On the morning of March 6th, Steinhoff was at his command post at Vernuken Airfield, 20 miles northeast of Berlin. His Geschwader was equipped with the latest Fokker-Wulf 190A8 fighters, superb aircraft with heavy armament specifically designed to destroy bombers. The morning reconnaissance reports had been routine, a large formation of American heavy bombers approaching from the west, following the now familiar pattern. P-47 Thunderbolts would escort them to the German border, then turn back as fuel ran low. P-38 Lightnings might penetrate a bit further, then the bombers would be alone. Steinhoff ordered his fighters to scramble at 0945 hours, timing the intercept for when the bombers would be deepest into German territory, furthest from help, most vulnerable. His 48 fighters rose from Vernuken in 2 Gruppen, climbing to 30,000 feet, positioning themselves between the bomber stream and Berlin. At 1015 hours, Steinhoff's radar controller reported the American formation approaching over 600 heavy bombers, B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, in their characteristic box formations. Right on schedule, the Thunderbolts had already turned back. This would be another successful intercept. Then the controller's voice changed. Herr Oberst, we have additional contacts. Single-engine fighters. At least 100 aircraft. Type unknown. They're still with the bombers. Steinhoff felt a cold finger trace his spine. That was impossible. They were 500 miles inside Germany. No single-engine fighter could be here. Confirm identification, he snapped. A pause. Then, confirmed. P-51 Mustangs. Squadron strength. They're not turning back. For a moment that stretched into seconds, Steinhoff's mind raced through possibilities. This changed everything. The entire defensive calculation that had governed Luftwaffe tactics for 18 months had just become obsolete. If American fighters could escort all the way to Berlin, then German fighters would have to engage them first, wasting fuel, ammunition, and pilots before reaching the bombers. The numerical advantage that came from concentrating forces against unescorted bombers would evaporate. The Americans could afford to lose fighters trading one for one with the Luftwaffe. Germany, with its dwindling pilot training program and shrinking fuel reserves, could not. But there was no time for strategic contemplation. The bombers were coming. His fighters were in position. The battle would happen whether doctrine had caught up with reality or not. "All fighters," Steinhoff transmitted, his voice steady despite the sudden recalculation of everything he thought he knew about this war. "American escorts at altitude, engage and destroy. For the fatherland." Captain Robert Johnson saw the German fighters first a flaw in their attack approach that gave him perhaps 15 seconds of advantage. They were climbing from below and behind, classic tactics for bouncing bombers, but tactics that made them vulnerable to the American fighters positioned above and ahead of the bomber stream. "Bandits, 4 o'clock low," Johnson transmitted, his voice calm despite his heart hammering. "Looks like 50 plus, 19s and 190s. Cobweb flight, drop tanks, and engage." All around him, 16 Mustangs of his squadron jettisoned their external tanks. The silver containers tumbled toward the German countryside 30,000 feet below, and suddenly the P-51 seconds were 400 pounds lighter, instantly more maneuverable, transformed from long-range escorts into pure fighters. Johnson rolled his Mustang inverted and pulled through into a dive, the Merlin engine roaring as airspeed climbed past 400 miles per hour. His wingman, Second Lieutenant Thomas "Tommy" Wade from Atlanta, Georgia, stayed glued to his right wing exactly where he was supposed to be. The German fighters saw them coming and tried to react, but they were at a devastating disadvantage. They had climbed to altitude burning fuel, were fully loaded with ammunition, and were accelerating from a climb. The Mustangs were diving, building energy, already at combat speed. Physics made the outcome almost inevitable. Johnson selected his target, a Focke-Wulf 190 painted in the mottled green and grey camouflage of a Reichsverteidigung squadron. The German pilot saw him coming and tried to turn into the attack, the classic defensive maneuver, but he was too slow. Johnson's K-14 gun sight, a miraculous piece of technology that calculated bullet drop and deflection, automatically put the firing pipper directly on the 190's engine cowling. At 300 yards, Johnson squeezed the trigger. 6 50-caliber machine guns erupted. The Mustang shuddered from the recoil. Tracer rounds, every fifth bullet drew a line of fire directly into the German fighter's engine. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then, the 190's cowling disintegrated in a spray of metal fragments. Black smoke poured from the engine. The propeller froze. The fighter nosed over and began falling. Johnson didn't watch it fall. Rule number 1, never fixate on a kill. He was already looking for the next threat, already clearing his 6 o'clock, already searching the sky. All around him, the air filled with swirling dogfights. Mustangs and German fighters merged in a chaotic melee at 28,000 feet. Condensation trails from high-speed maneuvers drew white spirals across the blue sky. Tracer fire arced in all directions. Aircraft tumbled toward Earth trailing smoke and flame. But Johnson noticed something immediately. The Germans were being forced to fight the escorts instead of attacking the bombers. Every German pilot who engaged a Mustang was a German pilot who wasn't firing rockets into B-17 formations. The entire mathematics of the battle had shifted. For 18 months, Luftwaffe fighters had been able to ignore American escorts after the first few minutes of combat. The escorts would run low on fuel and turn back, leaving the bombers exposed. German pilots could then focus entirely on the vulnerable heavy bombers, using tactics refined through months of trial and error to break up formations and destroy individual aircraft. But today, the escorts weren't leaving. They were here, over Berlin, with enough fuel to fight for another 20 minutes. That changed everything. Oberst Steinhoff fired a burst at a Mustang that flashed across his gun sight and missed the American pilot, pulling a high G turn that his Focke-Wulf couldn't match without bleeding dangerous amounts of airspeed. His fuel gauge showed he had perhaps 20 minutes of combat fuel remaining before he would have to break off and head for base. 20 minutes to fight through the American escorts, reposition, and attack the bombers. 20 minutes that would normally have been plenty of time because the American escorts would have been long gone. Except they weren't gone. Steinhoff counted the tactical implications in seconds. His fighters were burning fuel, fighting the Mustangs. The bombers were proceeding unmolested toward their target. By the time his unit fought through or around the escorts, they would have perhaps one attack pass at the bombers before fuel exhaustion forced them to land. One pass, one chance to do damage. Then watch the bombers continue to their target, drop their ordnance, and turn for home. And the Mustangs would still be there, waiting for the flight back. The defensive doctrine that had worked for 18 months was suddenly catastrophically obsolete. Steinhoff tried to reposition for a clear shot at the bomber stream, diving below the dogfight, trying to come up underneath where the B-17 seconds defensive fire was weakest. A Mustang followed him down the pilot, showing no concern about fuel, no hesitation about pursuing deep into German airspace. The Mustang closed rapidly. Steinhoff broke, being hard right, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, grey tunneling his vision. The American stayed with him. Another break, this time left, pulling as hard as the Focke-Wulf could sustain without stalling. The Mustang matched him effortlessly. Steinhoff had fought Allied fighters for 5 years. He knew their capabilities intimately. He knew how long they could stay, how far they could chase, when they would be forced to break off and head for home. Every calculation he had made in hundreds of combats told him this Mustang should be turning back right now, should be worried about fuel, should be starting the long flight back to England. But the Mustang wasn't turning back. Steinhoff made a decision that burned like acid. He abandoned the attack and dove for the deck, using the Focke-Wulf's excellent dive performance to open distance from his pursuer, heading for Werneuchen at low altitude where he might lose the American in ground clutter. Behind him, the Mustang broke off. Pursuit not because of fuel concerns, but because its pilot chose to return to the bomber stream rather than chase one German fighter all the way to the ground. That choice, that casual dismissal of a target because the American pilot had fuel to spare, told Steinhoff everything he needed to know about how the war had just changed. As he flew back to Werneuchen at treetop level, his mind was already composing the report he would have to write. The report that would tell the High Command that their fundamental assumptions about Allied fighter capabilities were wrong, that the invisible shield of fuel exhaustion that had protected German industry was gone, that from this day forward, American bombers would never again fly unescorted to any target in Germany, that they had lost the air war. Captain Robert Johnson checked his fuel gauge as the bomber stream turned for home, 85 gallons remaining, more than enough for the flight back to England. His squadron had lost 2 aircraft in dogfight, both pilots killed, but had claimed 14 German fighters destroyed and 7 damaged. More importantly, not a single bomber in their section of the stream had been shot down during the entire mission. The flak had been heavy over the target, and some B-17 seconds were badly damaged, but no massed fighter attacks had materialized. The Luftwaffe had been forced to fight the escorts instead of massacring the bombers. The mission report would show that of the 660 heavy bombers that struck Berlin and its industrial suburbs that day, only 11 were lost, a 1.7% loss rate. Acceptable, sustainable, the kind of numbers that meant the bombing campaign could continue. For comparison, the Schweinfurt raid 5 months earlier had lost 26% of the attacking force. The difference was the Mustang's range. As Johnson flew west toward England, the winter sun setting behind him, he understood that this mission marked a turning point. The Luftwaffe would adapt, would develop new tactics, would continue to fight with the desperate skill of men defending their homeland. But they could no longer do so with the advantage of fighting unescorted bombers. From this day forward, every bombing raid to Germany would have fighter escort all the way to the target and back. The mathematics had changed. The strategic equation had shifted. The war was far from over. Germany would fight with ferocious determination for another 14 months. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. 2 simple metal tanks pressed steel, equipped with fuel pumps, designed to be jettisoned, had accomplished what 1,000 bombers and 10,000 bombs had failed to achieve. They had broken the Luftwaffe's defensive shield. The cost in aluminum and engineering, approximately $200 per tank. The cost to Germany, the air war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. April 1944, Luftwaffe High Command Headquarters, Wild Park Werder, just outside Berlin. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland stood before a map of Europe covered in red pins, each one marking a Luftwaffe airfield, each one representing a defensive position that had become suddenly, terrifyingly inadequate. At 32 years old, Galland was the youngest general in the German armed forces and one of its most decorated fighter pilots with 104 confirmed victories. As General der Jagdflieger, general of the fighter arm, he commanded every fighter squadron defending the Reich. The position had once been enviable. Now it was impossible. The intelligence reports spread across the conference table told a story that grew worse with each passing week. Since the first long-range Mustang escort mission to Berlin on March 6th, American fighter groups had flown 47 deep penetration missions. Bomber losses had dropped from an average of 9.2% per mission in late 1943 to 3.5% in March 1944 to 2.8% in early April. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe fighter losses had skyrocketed. In January 1944, before the Mustangs arrived in force, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,311 fighters on all fronts. In February, 1,279. In March, after the Mustangs began escorting to Berlin, 2,115 fighters lost. April's numbers were tracking even higher. The Americans were destroying German fighters faster than German factories could build them. Worse, they were killing experienced pilots faster than the training program could replace them. A Luftwaffe fighter pilot in early 1944 had an average of 450 hours of flight training before entering combat. By comparison, an American pilot had 320 hours, but the American could afford to learn through experience because his side had numerical superiority. The German could not. Galland had done the mathematics a dozen times, hoping he had made an error, hoping the numbers would somehow work out differently. They never did. At current attrition rates, the Luftwaffe fighter force would be combat ineffective by summer. Not destroyed entirely, there would still be fighters, still be pilots, but unable to mount coordinated defensive operations, unable to concentrate sufficient force to break up bomber formations, reduced to ineffective pinprick attacks that might down a few bombers, but could not stop the systematic destruction of German industry. The drop tanks, Galland said to the assembled officers, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had fought this war since its first day. Everything changes because of the drop tanks. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, present to brief his unit's combat reports from March 6th, nodded grimly. His written report sat in Galland's stack of increasingly desperate situation assessments. "We assumed fuel exhaustion would protect us," Steinhoff said. "We built our entire defensive strategy around an invisible wall that would force American escorts to turn back before reaching Germany's industrial heartland. That wall no longer exists." Galland walked to the map, studying the red pins with the intensity of a man trying to solve an unsolvable problem. "We must adapt. We need jet fighters operational immediately. The Me-262 can outrun the Mustangs, can engage and disengage at will. We need the production increased tenfold." An aide, a young major who handled logistics, cleared his throat nervously. "Herr General, the jet program is proceeding, but we face shortages of critical alloys, trained pilots, fuel. Current production rate is 12 aircraft per month. The Führer has ordered that the Me-262 be modified as a bomber, which delays." Galland slammed his palm on the table, the sudden violence startling everyone in the room. "A bomber, the fastest fighter in existence, and he wants it modified to carry bombs." He caught himself, lowered his voice. Speaking against Hitler's decisions was dangerous even for a general. "Apologies. Continue." The major consulted his notes. At current production rates and training capacity, we can field perhaps 50 operational Me-2 162 seconds by July, possibly 150 by year's end. Meanwhile, American intelligence estimates they will have 1,200 long-range fighters operational in the European theatre by June, over 2,000 by August. The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. Another officer spoke up, Oberst Walter Dahl, a highly decorated ace commanding Jagdgeschwader 300. What if we concentrate our forces? Stop trying to defend everywhere. Let the Americans bomb some targets unopposed, but mass our fighters for devastating attacks on others. Make them pay such a price on those missions that they reconsider the entire campaign. Galland considered this. You're suggesting we accept some bomber raids as unstoppable, but make others prohibitively expensive? Exactly. The Americans can sustain 3% losses indefinitely. They cannot sustain 20% losses. If we concentrate 500 fighters on a single raid, ignore all others that day, we could potentially destroy 100 bombers in one mission. Do that twice in a week, and American public opinion might force them to reconsider daylight bombing. It was a sound tactical concept. It was also an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that Germany could no longer defend its entire territory, could only make selective stands at chosen points. Implement it, Galland ordered. Coordinate with all Jagdgeschwader commanders. We'll trial the concept next week. Choose a target the Americans cannot ignore, preferably one of their missions to Berlin or the Ruhr. Mass every available fighter. Make them bleed. But even as he gave the order, Galland knew it was a delaying tactic, not a solution. The Americans would adapt. They would increase escort strength, modify tactics, accept temporary higher losses, knowing that German attrition was unsustainable. The strategic equation had shifted fundamentally, and no amount of tactical brilliance could reverse it. The drop tanks had changed everything. Second, Lieutenant Marcus Webb should have died on April 11th, 1944. The two-year-old from Portland, Oregon, had been flying P-51 Mustangs with the 357th Fighter Group for exactly 6 weeks, when his squadron escorted a bombing raid to the Heinkel aircraft factory at Rostock, on Germany's Baltic coast, a 1,200-mile round trip that would have been impossible without drop tanks. Webb was a replacement pilot, fresh from training, assigned to replace a veteran killed over Brunswick 2 weeks earlier. He had flown 4 previous escort missions without firing his guns or seeing an enemy aircraft up close. The veterans in his squadron called him lucky, not because he was fortunate, but because they believed his luck would run out soon, as most replacement pilots' luck did. Over Rostock, Luftwaffe fighters attacked in force one of Galland's concentrated defensive efforts. Approximately 120 German fighters swarmed the bomber stream and its escorts. Webb's flight leader, Captain James Hammond, a veteran with 9 kills, led his 4-ship flight into the melee. "Stay on my wing, Lucky," Hammond transmitted. "Don't do anything stupid." Webb tried to comply, but aerial combat at 400 miles per hour, with aircraft twisting and diving and climbing in 3 dimensions, doesn't follow orderly plans. Within 90 seconds, Webb found himself separated from Hammond, alone in a sky full of fighters, with a Messerschmitt 109 closing on his 6 o'clock. The German pilot Unteroffizier Klaus Becker, though Webb would never know his name, was 19 years old, with 7 combat missions and 18 hours of total flight time in the Me-109. The Luftwaffe's training program had collapsed to the point where pilots were being sent to combat squadrons with barely enough experience to take off and land safely. Becker lined up on the Mustang, his inexperienced hands causing his fighter to wallow as he tried to track the target. He fired from 400 yards, far too distant for accurate shooting, and his burst went wide. Webb saw the tracer fire flash past his canopy and reacted with pure instinct. No thought, just training and terror. He yanked the stick hard right and back, pulling the Mustang into a gut-wrenching defensive turn that grayed his vision and crushed him into his seat with forces exceeding 6 Gs. The Messerschmitt tried to follow, but Becker, inexperienced with high-G maneuvering, pulled too hard. His aircraft stalled, the wings losing lift, the nose dropping uncontrollably. He panicked, pushed forward on the stick exactly the wrong input, and the 109 entered a spin. Webb, his Mustang now pointing almost vertically upward from his defensive turn, found himself looking down at the spinning Messerschmitt. Without conscious thought, operating on instinct and adrenaline, he rolled inverted, pulled through toward the German fighter, and dove. His airspeed built rapidly. 350 miles per hour, 400, 450, approaching the Mustang's limits. The spinning 109 grew larger in his gun sight. At 300 yards, Webb fired. His first combat trigger pull was a disaster. He jerked the trigger instead of squeezing smoothly, and his entire burst of .50 caliber fire went high and wide, missing the German fighter by 100 feet. The recoil from 6 machine guns slowed his dive, and the German fighter fell away below him, still spinning, now too low to safely pursue. Webb had failed to shoot down an enemy fighter that was helpless, spinning, a perfect target. Any experienced pilot would have made the kill easily. But Webb had survived his first combat. He had engaged an enemy, maneuvered defensively, and lived to try again. For a replacement pilot in April 1944, that was an achievement. More significantly, Klaus Becker recovered from his spin at 8,000 feet, his hands shaking so badly he could barely control his aircraft. He flew back to his base at Parchim, landed, and sat in his cockpit for 10 minutes trying to stop trembling before he could climb out. Both young men had survived an encounter neither had been prepared for. Both had learned lessons that might keep them alive for their next combat, and both owed their survival, indirectly, to drop tanks Webb because his squadron had fuel to escort bombers this deep into Germany. Becker because the Luftwaffe's training program had been devastated by fuel shortages and the need to rush partially trained pilots into combat to replace catastrophic losses. The drop tanks were killing German pilots not just in combat, but by forcing Germany to send inadequately trained young men into battles they couldn't survive. By May 1944, the transformation was complete. American fighters equipped with drop tanks escorted every major bombing raid into Germany. The 8th Air Force flew with virtual impunity to targets that had been unreachable 6 months earlier. The statistics told the story with brutal clarity. In March 1944, American bombers dropped 24,527 tons of bombs on German targets, with a loss rate of 3.5%. In April, 39,048 tons dropped, loss rate 2,9%. In May, 42,919 tons dropped, loss rate 2,3%. Meanwhile, Luftwaffe losses accelerated catastrophically. March 1,944, 2,115 fighters lost April, 2,443 fighters lost May, 2,862 fighters lost. The Luftwaffe was losing more fighters in a month than it lost in the entire first year of the war. German factories were producing approximately 1,000 fighters per month, insufficient to replace losses. The fighter force was slowly bleeding to death, but the drop tank's impact extended far beyond simple numbers of aircraft destroyed. The real strategic victory was in forcing Germany to divert resources to the air war that could have been used elsewhere. By May 1944, Germany was allocating 30% of all artillery production to anti-aircraft guns, 20% of all ammunition production to anti-aircraft shells, 50% of all electronics production to radar and fire control systems, 55% of all optical production to gun sights and rangefinders, 1/3 of total German steel production to anti-aircraft defences. 1 million Germans were engaged in air defence duties, manning flak guns, operating radar stations, clearing bomb damage, firefighting, repairing infrastructure. These were people and resources that could have been building tanks for the Eastern Front, fortifying the Atlantic Wall, maintaining supply lines, producing rifles and ammunition. Additionally, Germany had to keep substantial fighter forces in the west to defend against bombing raids. In May 1944, approximately 70% of German fighter strength, over 1,800 aircraft, was stationed in Germany and France, defending against Anglo-American air power. Only 30% was available for the Eastern Front, where the Soviet Union was preparing its massive summer offensive. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander preparing for the Normandy invasion, studied intelligence reports about Luftwaffe dispositions with satisfaction. The strategic bombing campaign, regardless of whatever physical damage that it does to German industry, he wrote to Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, has already justified itself by forcing Germany to commit massive resources to air defense, resources they desperately need elsewhere. The drop tanks, costing $200 each, had accomplished what a million-man invasion might not have. They had forced Germany into a war of attrition it could not win. June 6, 1944. The beaches of Normandy. As 156,000 Allied soldiers stormed ashore in the largest amphibious invasion in history, the Luftwaffe was almost invisible. German fighters made only brief, ineffective appearances over the beaches. Allied air forces flew over 14,000 sorties on D-Day. The Luftwaffe managed approximately 300. The disparity was staggering. Where was the Luftwaffe? Where were the hundreds of fighters that should have been available to attack vulnerable landing craft and soldiers on exposed beaches? The answer lay in hundreds of crashed and burning fighters scattered across German airfields from the previous month's battles. It lay in hundreds of pilot graves, the experienced aviators killed in futile attempts to stop the American bomber offensive. It lay in training schools that could no longer provide adequate instruction due to fuel shortages. It lay in factories bombed into rubble by the very bombers the Luftwaffe had failed to stop. The drop tanks hadn't just enabled escort fighters to protect bombers. They had systematically destroyed the Luftwaffe's capability to contest Allied air superiority anywhere. Captain Robert Johnson flew a mission over Normandy on D-Day, his Mustang equipped with the now standard 2 drop tanks. He spent 6 hours airborne, patrolling over the invasion beaches, and never saw a single German aircraft. The contrast with his first mission to Berlin 3 months earlier, when the sky had been filled with German fighters, was profound. "It's over," he radioed to his wingman Tommy Wade, who had survived the Berlin mission and every mission since. "They're finished." Wade's response was characteristically laconic. "Let's hope they know it." But Germany didn't know it, or wouldn't accept it. The war would continue for another 11 brutal months. German pilots would keep fighting with desperate courage against impossible odds. Young men like Klaus Becker, who had survived his April encounter with Marcus Webb only to die 3 weeks later when his fuel-starved engine quit on approach to his airfield, would keep dying in a lost cause. The Luftwaffe would introduce jet fighters too late and in too few numbers to matter strategically. Germany would develop rocket-powered interceptors, heavily armed bomber destroyers, even suicide ramming tactics where pilots deliberately rammed enemy bombers. None of it would reverse the fundamental equation. By December 1944, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as an organized defensive force. Individual pilots and small units continued fighting, but coordinated defensive operations became impossible. American bombers flew to their targets and back with such regularity that bomber crews complained the missions were boring, a stark contrast to the terror of 1943. The drop tanks had won the air war, but the price paid in human lives was staggering on both sides. Between March and December 1944, the 8th Air Force lost 2,563 heavy bombers, despite fighter escort, representing approximately 25,000 aircrew killed, missing, or captured. Fighter losses added another 800 pilots killed. The Luftwaffe's losses were catastrophically higher. Between January and December 1944, Germany lost approximately 23,000 fighter aircraft on all fronts, with over 15,000 of those losses occurring defending the Reich against the American bombing campaign. Approximately 13,000 Luftwaffe pilots were killed in 1944, nearly the entire strength of the fighter force at the war's beginning. Marcus Webb survived the war with 11 confirmed kills, a Distinguished Flying Cross, and nightmares that would persist for decades. He returned to Portland, worked as a commercial airline pilot, and rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he focused on the technical aspects: aircraft performance, tactics, navigation, never on the human cost, never on the faces he had seen in the split seconds before his guns fired. Johannes Steinhoff also survived, though barely. He was shot down 4 times between March and May 1944, bailing out twice and crash-landing twice. In April 1945, flying one of the first operational Me-262 jets, he crashed on takeoff when his aircraft suffered engine failure. The resulting fire left him with third-degree burns over 60% of his body. He spent 2 years in hospitals, undergoing painful reconstructive surgeries. Post-war, Steinhoff would serve in the new German Luftwaffe, eventually reaching the rank of 4-star general and serving as Chief of Staff of the German Air Force from 1966 to 1970. He wrote several books about his experiences, including one titled The Straits of Messina, about his time in Sicily. But his most introspective work was Neither Fear Nor Hope, published in 1970, which examined the moral complexity of serving with skill and honor in a fundamentally evil cause. In that book, Steinhoff wrote about March 6, 1944, the day the Mustangs first escorted to Berlin with the clarity of hindsight. We knew in that moment, though we could not admit it even to ourselves, that we had lost. Not the battle we would fight many more battles, win some, lose others. But the war, the Americans had solved the equation we believed was unsolvable. They had extended their fighters' range beyond what we calculated was aerodynamically possible, and in doing so, they had removed the only advantage we possessed, the ability to attack unescorted bombers. From that day, we were fighting not to win, but merely to delay the inevitable. Adolf Galland was relieved of his command in January 1945, after repeated clashes, with Hermann Göring over the mismanagement of the Luftwaffe. He spent the final months of the war commanding Jagdverband 44, an elite jet fighter unit flying Me-262 seconds in a futile last stand. He survived the war, was briefly imprisoned, then released. He later served as an aviation consultant in Argentina and eventually returned to Germany, where he wrote several influential books on air combat tactics and strategy. In his 1954 memoir, The First and the Last, Galland devoted an entire chapter to the impact of long-range escort fighters. The introduction of the American Mustang fighter with external drop tanks marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe. We could no longer fight the war on our terms. We could no longer choose when and where to engage. We could no longer attack bombers without first fighting through their escorts, and we could not win a war of attrition against an enemy with 10 times our production capacity and an inexhaustible supply of fresh pilots. The drop tanks, simple as they were, changed the strategic balance of the air war more decisively than any technological development on either side. The drop tank technology developed for the P-51 Mustang became standard equipment for fighter aircraft worldwide. Post-war jet fighters universally employed external fuel tanks, with designs becoming progressively more sophisticated. The engineering principles established in 1943–44 aerodynamic shaping to minimize drag, reliable high-altitude fuel transfer, quick-release mechanisms for combat jettison remained fundamentally unchanged into the 21st century. Modern fighter aircraft like the F-16 Fighting Falcon, F/A-18 Super Hornet, and F-35 Lightning II all employ external fuel tanks designed according to principles first proven on the Mustang. The strategic lesson was equally enduring. In modern warfare, logistics often matters more than firepower. The side that can project power furthest, stay in the fight longest, and sustain operations most efficiently will prevail regardless of tactical superiority in individual engagements. The US military's emphasis on tanker aircraft, forward basing, and extended operational range for all combat systems traces directly to the lessons learned from the Mustangs' drop tanks. The ability to operate at extended distances from bases, to escort bombers or conduct strikes without worrying about fuel exhaustion, became a cornerstone of American military doctrine. In the end, the story of the P-51 Mustang's drop tanks is a story about mathematics and human will, about how engineering solutions to tactical problems can have strategic consequences, about how small innovations can tip the balance of great conflicts. 2 pressed steel tanks, worth $400 combined, enabled a fighter aircraft to escort bombers 850 miles from base. That extended range forced Germany to fight a war of attrition it could not win, diverted massive resources from other critical needs, and contributed directly to the collapse of German air defenses. The human cost of that collapse, measured in tens of thousands of young men who died in burning aircraft or in parachutes that failed to open or in desperate crash landings, haunted the survivors for the rest of their lives. Robert Johnson retired from the Air Force in 1972 as a full colonel. He settled in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where he worked as a consultant for aerospace companies. He attended airshow reunions occasionally, but increasingly rarely, as the years passed and friends died. He passed away in 1998 at age 80, his obituary noting his 27 confirmed aerial victories and his role in some of the most significant missions of World War II. But Johnson's most revealing comments about his experiences came in an interview conducted in 1991 by a military historian. Asked what he remembered most clearly about the war, Johnson didn't talk about victories or medals or the excitement of combat. "I remember the fuel gauges," he said. "Every mission, I'd watch those gauges, calculating range and time, knowing that whether we lived or died often came down to having enough fuel to get home. The drop tanks gave us that margin. They gave us 200 extra miles, which meant we could escort the bombers all the way, which meant the bombers could actually hit their targets, which meant we were winning instead of losing. It all came down to fuel. Everything in that war came down to logistics more than glory. The guys who figured out how to make those drop tanks work, the engineers, the designers, the guys who never flew a combat mission, they won the air war. We just flew the planes." In a hangar at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, a restored P-51D Mustang hangs from the ceiling, 2 silver drop tanks still attached to its wings. A placard explains the aircraft's technical specifications and combat history, but it doesn't fully capture the significance of those 2 simple metal tanks. They weren't just fuel, containers. They were the key that unlocked Allied air superiority over Europe. They were the innovation that made strategic bombing effective. They were the tool that forced Germany into an unwinnable war of attrition. They were, in the end, one of the most decisive weapons of World War II, not because they destroyed anything directly, but because they enabled everything else that followed. German pilots never expected external drop tanks would turn Mustangs into 1,650-mile Escorts. By the time they realized what had happened, the war was already lost. The tanks that changed history weighed 40 pounds empty, cost $200 each, and held 108 gallons of fuel. They were disposable, meant to be jettisoned after use, often manufactured by companies that had previously made automotive parts or farm equipment. But they won the air war over Europe. Sometimes the most important innovations are the simplest ones. Sometimes victory doesn't come from super weapons or revolutionary tactics, but from solving basic problems: how to carry more fuel, how to extend range, how to stay in the fight long enough to matter. The P-51 Mustang's drop tanks solved that problem, and in solving it, they changed the course of World War II. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.